I really am in a most uncomfortable position, but I'm broadcasting to you this intro anyway, from a maple tree today because, well, why the hell not? And also, for the sake of branding, this is a channel called Reading in Trees, and I thought I ought to get myself up into a tree at one point. And today I am reviewing a book called In Ascension by Martin McInnes, which is all about the sublime on every scale and attempts to trigger our biophilia, our natural affinity with the natural world, to show us our place in it, to lead us back to it, to help us make peace with the connection, the oneness of everything that is on earth, and more than anything, perhaps to quicken a new philosophy or spirituality that can perhaps mend the rift between humans and all the other earthlings. Welcome back. I am Leah and this is Reading in Trees. And thus far I've been mainly, in the early stages of this channel, been discussing books and bookish topics. And to be honest, I don't really know what I am. And what I do know is that I like whatever this is, whatever I am. And I intend to go on. But I don't know what iterations this channel is going to undergo. Except that I do like talking about books, and I like talking about sort of expansive global ideas, utopias, and the well-being of sentient life on Earth. Today I am reviewing this book, In Ascension by Martin McInnes. I believe it is Martin McInnes's third book, and it has been longlisted for the Booker Prize in 2023. Last year, it's also the winner of Blackwell's Book of the Year. It is categorized as, or being described as, literary sci-fi, which I think is somewhat of a good description of the book. However, I would say that it leans more towards the literary than the sci-fi, in the sense that people who already like literary fiction will probably be more drawn to this book than sci-fi readers, but I might be wrong in that intuition. I like sci-fi myself, but I don't think most sci-fi reads like this. This reads like a literary novel. The emphasis is very much on the certain themes in the book, and it's very character driven. We get very close, in a sense, to our protagonist, and we follow her very closely over her lifespan. But I would say that the writing is also exquisite. It is beautiful writing. If you appreciate that, if that's something that you enjoy, then you might like this book as well. It's very slow at times. The plot can slow down to a crawl, and it's very contemplative and very kind of, I suppose, atmospheric and almost hypnotic in a way, you might say, if you're being generous. Others might call that boring. It has been described as such by some people. Some people find it very hard to get into the book, but I will have more to say about that later. The book starts in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where Lee, our protagonist, has spent her childhood. Her family is Dutch, and her childhood, as she recounts it, and it seems to be almost devoid of happiness, or at least she focuses more on the unhappy elements, and seems to have been quite a tormented child. And this is because her father was abusive, and her mother, rather than protecting her, as Lee sees her, having had the responsibility to protect her, but she didn't step in to do so. But she's quite distant and cool as an individual, and she seems to seek refuge from the world in her passion, which is mathematics. And Lee has a sister called Helena, a younger sister, who seems better equipped to avoid a lot of the abuse coming from their father. And they develop a complicated relationship in the book, and she serves as a point of contrast for Lee because they're quite different. From the age of 10, Lee is permitted to swim in the river Nieuwe Maas, I believe is the pronunciation, and it offers her a temporary escape from her family life, which is almost unbearable for her. She has a real issue with going home, and the escape, though important for her, is always temporary, and one day she moves to make it permanent, which, she wants to use the river for a more permanent escape, and she But when she's submerged under the water with her eyes open, she has a transcendent experience where she feels like the boundaries of her own body have dissolved and she is mixing with all the microorganisms in the river. And it is like an out of body experience for her. And the ecstasy of that experience in the river leads her to a lifelong passion in microbiology, and she eventually goes on to pursue a career in microbiology. And it really is a kind of a turning point for her. So she pursues this career in microbiology, and as she does so, she moves increasingly further away from her family. Leap forward many years when she's doing research for her master's in the Azores, and she learns that there has been a great leap forward in propulsive technology, such that spacecraft will be able to travel like tens of thousands of times further than the current technology permits. And she sees this, even though like the fruition of that technology is way down the line, she sees this as hope for a species, for humanity that is currently bereft of it, because the specter of climate change is always kind of looming in the background of the story, and sometimes it raises its head unexpectedly and influences elements in the plot, but it's always there as a kind of dark cloud over everything that is happening on Earth. Later on, again, her supervisor secures her a position on a research boat, an expedition in the Atlantic, and it's a menial role on the ship, but there are many scientists on board and also corporate representatives. And she doesn't even know what the objective of the mission is until she's sort of well into the voyage. And it turns out that they're headed towards a hydrothermal vent, a newly discovered hydrothermal vent, which is kind of mysterious because it's thought that, the topography of the ocean floor is pretty much known at this stage. This news is very exciting for Lee because, as a microbiologist who studies ancient organisms, she knows that these hydrothermal vents create the conditions that resemble a young Earth when life was the origin of life really arose in. And for example, they're home to archaea.
Okay, I'm sure this is not the only word that I will mispronounce in this video, but do not say archaea, it is archaea. I didn't think to check this before I started filming, of course, and I shall now proceed to mispronounce archaea one more time. Thank you very much.
And it was the union of archaea and bacteria that is thought to have led to eukaryotic cells and multi-celled organisms. So, and even when she was a child, she sought a kind of psychological refuge in the idea that her body was an ecology for these ancient organisms. And when they reach the site, there is some kind of anxiety, I guess, on board because the the vent is a newly found vent, and then to make matters more mysterious, their instruments keep showing readings of the vent being way deeper than seems possible or likely. And for example, they get readings that say that this vent is 3 times the depth of the Mariana Trench. And so it's almost like there is an entity, there's an agency to the vent, and that is messing with their research and their efforts to try and understand it, and it creates a kind of ominous air. And then when the first divers go down, although it is fascinating for Lee, especially Lee is very eager to go down. When the first divers do go down, they it seems what Lee describes is something quite ecstatic and otherworldly, the experience. But when she comes back, her memory is affected, and all of the divers become very ill, and they vomit, they can't keep food down, and they're feverish, and they have strange dreams. But they eventually recover, but they're left with this kind of draw back to the trench, to go back down into the trench. And Lee wonders if this has something to do with the archaea in her body wanting to return to their origins. Fast forward a number of years, still when she's in her 30s or around 30, and she has the opportunity to join a space project that's going to use this new propulsive technology, and she's coming on as a consultant who's going to help them develop an algae crop for consumption on the ship. In some sense, this is kind of where the story gets started, and everything that I've told you is a kind of a very extended forward. So I'm not going to tell you anymore. You'll have to read the book. The primary character in this book is Lee. She's the protagonist. And for most of the book, we see everything from her perspective. And though she's a complicated and interesting character, she is a character that isolates herself. And because she doesn't really let people in, we don't really get a chance to see other fleshed out characters and her relationships with them. So that might be something that frustrates some people. It takes you out of the book a little bit, and it makes it harder for you to invest yourself in Lee's story. So if I'm to talk about writing style, I'm going to also be talking about things like Lee's character, because Lee is the primary narrator, so everything is through her perspective. And I think that the writing, first of all, I just want to say the writing is very beautiful. I said that earlier. It conjures very complex imagery, and in a sense, it's a kind of mind-bending nature writing, and it's quite philosophical about nature, almost verging on spiritual about our connections with nature, because I think that's what it's like for Lee to pursue her interest. Her desire to understand the natural world is something transcendent for her. So I sort of touched on, when discussing Lee's character, the fact that there's a kind of distance between you and Lee, even though she seems generous in how much she reveals about her own thoughts, her inner world. Lee perhaps isn't fully honest with herself, and this creates, when people haven't accepted themselves, they will naturally keep others at arm's length. And I feel like as a reader, that was happening between me and the protagonist. It's hard to immerse yourself in a scene because there's a lot of jumping around from different points in time, and also kind of Lee will start, in the middle of something happening, will suddenly jump to a soliloquy of Lee's about something scientific or about something from her past. And it happens enough that it feels like everything is a bit of a dream, and there's a bit of a garbling of reality. She sometimes rushes a scene, and there's a kind of economy of words, so much so that it's hard to really get into the scene. There could be something quite urgent happening, but you don't feel the urgency because her head is hopping around to different topics and a little bit too philosophical. I don't want to give the impression that those tendencies towards philosophizing or being pensive, that those aren't interesting as well. But for the story itself, it's not tight and it doesn't feel incredibly compelling. So one of the themes in this book is certainly climate change. And I described earlier how it's kind of in the background, but occasionally rears its ugly head when it, for example, affects the health of one of the characters. I think it's actually quite a good rendering of what the real life experience for many people when thinking about climate change, because it is something that they put to the backs of their minds most of the time, I think. And it certainly was the case for most people up until recently. Maybe people are thinking about it more now. It's still a capitalist world just like ours, and the earth is a vessel of resources, and as the vessel is emptying, the earth is losing its value, and from the capitalist perspective. And so the focus is shifting away now to the cosmos, because there's so much virgin territory there and untapped resources. And so really the value was always just in the resources. Life in general is secondary to the profit motive. And people literally sign away the rights to their own bodies. At every scale, the sacred is sacrificed for the sordid. With stupefying hubris, corporate entities get to decide how we go to space, what our objectives are there, and how the whole human story rolls out. And it's not the people that have any say in this. It's corporate power deciding human history. There is one very important theme that McInnes really makes the story pulsate with, and that's the idea of the cycle. And it itself recurs again and again in the story in different ways. So you see it in animal behavior and in the structure of microorganisms, and you see it in Lee's life herself, in her narrative, and how she keeps coming back to the same memories and thoughts, and how it reminded me of the golden spiral. And maybe you could say that all human life is kind of like this. The narrative self resembles this structure of like early memories, and then over that you kind of keep returning to them in a sense, and you're building on them and you're changing, but they're always there influencing the outer rings, so to speak. And as well, there are kind of like cycles within the cycle of the structure of the book, and sort of fractal in nature. And it has a really profound significance in the story as well. So connection features really large as a theme in this book, and as I mentioned in the intro of this video, it's about the interconnectedness of life, and but on every scale, you know, on the very, very small and the very large. So also our connection to outer space, but really the focus is on Earth and the interconnectedness of all life, and with our relationships as well, in terms of our human relationships, and a reminder to value Earth above all else, lest we forget where our feet are standing while we lose ourselves in the stars. One of the things observed about Lee is that it's easy for her to romanticize what is distant, far from her. She seems to appreciate it more, in a sense, and but we have to remember that what we consider banal, whether it's, you know, Earth versus outer space, or the esoteric versus our relationships with the people close to us, that also offers us more direct access to the sublime, arguably, because, you know, life's incredibly improbable. It's very rare, and also because it's more important to us, because it's so integral to who we are. So our relationships with each other, it's more important to us and our well-being. You know, I'm kind of cycling back now and restating things that I touched on earlier, but I think that in many ways the best experiences are thought to involve transcending the self and losing the defined borders of the self, and that distinguish us from the environment that we're in, from the rest of the world and being. And whether it's through, you know, like spiritual experiences or meditation, or through awe or orgasmic ecstasy or what have you. And this book, you know, it has a lot to do with ascent and transcendence of the self, an ascent out of the mysterious trench, an ascent into space and out of the solar system. But it also has to do, I think, with descent, with coming home, with placing your feet firmly on terra again, with sort of rolling up your sleeves and getting down to the true meaningful work, and with honoring the sacredness of our relationships with each other. And when I say each other, I don't mean just with humans, I mean with all life on this incredibly improbable planet, life-supporting planet called Earth. Ultimately, I gave In Ascension 4 stars out of 5 because I thought it was a beautifully written book, but sometimes the writing style or the structure, perhaps the character, could prevent the full emotional investment in the story. It wasn't always as immersive as I would have liked. However, I think that what it attempts to do is to reunite the reader with their place in the natural world, and maybe even it goes further than that and tries to spur you to action to save it, because it shows us what it might be like to have everything vital in the world taken away from us. I hope you enjoyed this review of In Ascension by Martin McInnes. And if you have read this book and have your own take on it, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Perhaps you have recommendations for books that are similar to this one. I'd like to hear that too. Yeah, I will be following this video soon with a TBR, which is not really something that I set out to do at the beginning of this channel, but you know, it's something to try. I'm being very experimental still. It's very much a hobby, but it is something that I would like to see grow. Until then, stay well, stay curious, and stay reading.